Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Red Pill Garage. On today's episode, I'm going to teach you how to change the front wheel bearings on a Honda Jazz. The tools required for this job today is a hub separator toolkit. Now you're going to need this toolkit if you're going to do this job at home, but today I'll be using my shop press. Next is a press toolkit, torque wrench, hammer, punches, some ring spanners, 17 and 19, 12 and 13, 15, 16 combination spanner, a 19, a 17, some ratchet spanners, circlip pliers, long nose pliers, side cutters, some screwdrivers, vice grips, 3/8 drive ratchet, impact screwdriver, a rattle gun, your brake cleaner and WD-40, copperies, Loctite, impact sockets and the bearing puller. And of course, don't forget the safety glasses. Okay, now it's time to remove the wheel. Now when doing this job at home, it's best to slip the wheel near the jack stands under the car for that extra safety. You can see here, the last person to work on this car did not hit the hub nut into that groove of the CV shaft. But now we need to push that dent out, that hub nut, so when we unscrew the hub nut, we don't actually tear the end of the hub nut off. Okay, next I'm going to remove the caliper guide pin bolts. I'm going to remove the caliper now out of the way. Just make sure when you're doing this job you don't drop the caliper, causing any damage to the ABS wire or even the brake hose itself. And now the brake pads. Just make sure when you're removing the brake pads you don't mix them up like the inner pad and the outer pad. And you can see the impression of the brake piston on the inner pad itself, and the wear indicator clip sits in the bottom. Next I'm going to remove the caliper cradle bracket bolts. Okay, now I'm going to secure that brake caliper with a hook and just get that out of the way and keep that safe as well. Okay, I'm going to use some WD-40 now, and I'm going to spray that around the hub and disc surface area. It tends to rust up around there, and also the CV shaft spines as well. They tend to rust up and they can be quite stubborn to come out. Okay, while that WD-40 is soaking in, we're going to remove our retaining screws on the disc with our impact driver. And now that we've unscrewed the retaining screws, the disc should just pop straight off. Okay, next I'm going to remove the wire safety clip. It's also called an R-type clip. Now these clips, you can reuse them, there's no need to throw them away like the cotter pins or a split pin. And you can see there it's got an R shape to it. Next I'm going to spray some WD-40 on that castle nut for the ball joint. This way it's a lot easier to remove. Now what you'll find, that castle nut, you won't be able to unscrew it all the way because it's going to run into the CV shaft. And there's a couple of ways you can do this. You can remove the CV shaft, or you can knock out the bottom bore joint. I prefer to knock out the bottom bore joint. Now to gain access to the bore joint, when turning the steering, turn it very slowly because you don't want to blow out any of the rack seals and cause an oil leak. Now if you're going to use a hammer to hit the steering knuckle, make sure you aim in that spot right there. If you're not confident, you'll have to purchase a steering suspension puller kit like this one. Now the downside to using one of these kits, if you're not sure on what you're doing, you run the risk of tearing the ball joint boot. Okay, now by pulling down on that lower control arm, you should be able to remove that castle nut, but try not to get the ball joint to pop out like I did. And if that happens, just push it back in, because you'll need that ball joint back in that steering knuckle for now. Okay, next I'm going to remove the tie rod end nut. Now when unscrewing this nut, don't completely remove the nut off the tie rod end, just sit it flush with the threads at the bottom of the stud there. And the reason for this, if you miss with a hammer, you won't damage the threads, you'll just hit that nut, so you won't cause any damage. Okay, now that the tie rod end is out of the way, it's now time to remove the ABS sensor. And we're going to crack and remove that 10mm nut. Now sometimes if you're lucky, they pull straight out, and sometimes they seize up and you just have to spray it with some WD-40 just to let it soak in. Now if you do come across an ABS sensor that's seized in there, don't go prying it out with any screwdrivers or tools because they are made out of plastic and they will break. Just gently wiggle them backwards and forwards and spray plenty of penetrating oil in there, and they eventually will come out. And now the ABS wire clip. And next, the caliper brake hose. There's a 12mm bolt back there. Okay, once we've got our brake hose and our ABS wire out of the way, we now have access to our steering knuckle bolts. Okay, now we can remove the steering knuckle and hub assembly. And earlier when I said to leave the ball joint back in the steering knuckle, for this reason, because if it was out, the whole thing could just slip out and fall on the floor. So that's just that added support by having it still mounted in there. Okay, now using the shop press, I'm going to use the press plates and place those between the wheel bearing hub and the steering knuckle. Because what we want to do first is press out that hub so we can get to the wheel bearing. Now for that, I'll be using the press sleeve. Now you have to be careful when using these tools, you've got to choose the right diameter, because at this stage we don't want to press the bearing because the bearing is held in with a circlip. We want to press the hub out, so that's the inner part first. So you have to make sure the sleeve that's being used on this has to be a tiny bit smaller than the bearing itself, not to foul the bearing when it's pressing through. Now you'll see here I'll be using very little force and that hub will come straight out. If you had problems getting that hub off, that means you're using the wrong size diameter sleeve and it's fouling the bearing, not making contact with the hub. Okay, the hub is out. It looks like the inner race of the wheel bearing is still stuck on the hub. That's it there. Now it does happen from time to time, but it just means extra work to get it off now. We'll do that later on. Now I'm going to spray some WD-40 around that circlip, also known as a circlip retaining ring. They can be quite stubborn to get off, so you want to make sure you're still wearing your safety glasses. It's really important to remember which way the wheel bearing's facing. You don't want to go putting it in the wrong way around. I'll explain later on. Now I'm going to remove the brake dust shield screws. Now these things are quite tight. If you're lucky, they might come off with a screwdriver, or you can use an impact screwdriver, but you'll need to mount the steering knuckle in a vise to stop it from moving around. But I prefer to do it this way. Okay, now that the brake dust shield and the circlip retainer has been removed, it's just a matter of finding the right size diameter sleeve, and then we can go over to the press to press out that wheel bearing. Okay, now I'm pressing out the bearing. Now when using a press, it moves in small increments. So I've sped the video up so you guys get an idea on how this works. Now there's a couple of reasons why presses move slowly. First reason is not to damage what you're working on, and second of all, and probably the most important part, is not to cause any personal injury to yourself. There's our steering knuckle with no wheel bearing in it, and that's what the wheel bearing looks like. Okay, now I'm going to press out the inner wheel bearing race off the wheel bearing hub. Now I always recommend replacing the wheel bearing hub and never reusing the same one, because it can give you problems, and what happens is over time that inner wheel bearing race can come away from the wheel bearing hub itself, creating a grinding noise when driving, and it simulates like when you've run out of brakes. It's the same type of noise. Now the reason why I'm reusing the same hubs today, because the lady that owns this car simply can't afford to replace them with new ones. Okay, now that we've got everything pulled apart, the next step is to reassemble everything. Now before we do that, we'll give that steering knuckle a clean up on the inside with some brake cleaner, and make sure at the bottom there where the wheel bearing sits, there's no grit or crud sitting down there, because we can't have the bearing kinking to one side. So it has to be thoroughly cleaned. Remember earlier when I said to take note which way the bearing goes? Because once you press it in, there's no going back. You want to make sure you get it in the right way, otherwise the ABS warning light will come up on the dashboard. And that means you have to redo the whole job all over again. As you can see there, the wheel bearing is not in all the way. We still have a few more millimeters to go. So we're going to flip that over and use the old wheel bearing. We're going to sit that on top and press the rest of it in. Also, this bearing has an ABS magnetic sensor built into the one seal, and it's only one seal, and that's why it's critical to get it right the first time. It must be mounted in the correct direction for the ABS to function correctly. Okay, that wheel bearing should be in all the way now. You can see that seal there is a different colour to the one on the other side of the bearing. So that's a simple way of telling which way you've got it in there. Okay, now I'm going to fit that circlip retainer. That should just snap into place. And once it's in there, give it a little twist to make sure it is in the groove, it's not binding. So this way you know it's in there properly. Now I recommend using some thread locker or Loctite for the brake dust shield retaining screws. Then screwing them down tightly with a screwdriver and not an impact driver. And once you've done that, now it's time to press the wheel bearing hub into the wheel bearing. And just make sure the hub surface where it meets the bearing is clean, and you can just clean that with a bit of brake cleaner. That's all you'll need. When using a press, I like to move the steering knuckle from side to side as it's pressing down, and the reason why I do this, just to make sure nothing is binding, because if it jams up and you can't turn it, then you'll know you'll have to back off and not cause any damage. But if you keep going, you'll ruin the whole job. And because it's moving freely, you know there's not going to be a problem. It's going in nice and easy like it should. And that's it, all the press work's finished. Now it's time to reassemble it on the car. Okay, now I'm going to clean up that rusty residue on the CV shaft spines. Just give it a thorough clean to get rid of all that rusty residue. And it's just a bit of brake cleaner, that's all. And just wipe it down with a rag once you're done. Now we're going to use the copper ease. Now this is a really good anti-seize product. It can withstand almost 1100 degrees Celsius. Okay, now it's time to mount the steering knuckle assembly. Feed the CV shaft through the wheel bearing hub first, and then mount it onto the ball joint. Once you've mounted it onto the ball joint, you won't have to worry about the whole unit falling out. Now I'm going to fit the steering knuckle bolts. I'm only just going to sit them in there for now, just to hold the whole assembly in place and stopping it from falling forward. Now clean the hub surface with a bit of brake cleaner and mount the disc on there. And the hub nut. You can leave that finger loose for now, but tighten it up later on. And semi-tighten the steering knuckle bolts up now. Now you don't want to fully tighten these up with a rattle gun because you may snap the bolts or strip the threads. You're best to finish it off by hand. This way you can actually feel how tight you're going. Okay, now I'm going to fit the disc retaining screws. And you can fully tighten these up all the way. And there's no need for any thread locker on these screws, because once you do them up, they're fairly tight. Okay, now I can tighten up the tie rod end. And you can fully tighten that nut up all the way. And now fit the castle nut to the ball joint and tighten that up all the way also. So we need to line up the castle nut with the hole in the ball joint so we can pass the wire safety clip through, and this will prevent the nut from unscrewing and coming loose. Okay, now that clips in all the way and it's locked in, it won't come out. And now for the tie rod end, we actually use what's called a cotter pin or a split pin. This type of pin you can't actually reuse because it's only made out of a soft metal. It's a one-use item. Okay, now it's time to fit the caliper cradle bracket. Before mounting those bolts into place, make sure you buff them on the wire wheel, or if you don't have a wire wheel, a steel brush is fine. then make sure you apply the Loctite on there and then fully tighten the bolts up all the way. Okay, next we're going to clean the disc rotor with some brake cleaner, get all the grease off it, and we're going to do that to both sides. Just give it a thorough clean with the rag once you've sprayed the brake cleaner on there. And now it's time to fit the brake pads, and make sure you don't mix up the sides where the brake pads belong. You can see the brake piston impression on that brake pad, so we know that's going in the right spot. Okay, next I'm going to refit the brake ABS sensor. Now don't tighten that up too tight because it's only made out of plastic. Now it's time to mount the caliper and the caliper guide pin bolts. Make sure they're buffed up on the wire wheel as well before applying the Loctite. Like I said, if you don't have a wire wheel, a wire brush is fine. And then you can tighten these bolts up all the way too. Okay, next I'm going to tighten up the brake caliper hose with a 12mm spanner. Make sure everything's nice and tight. Double check your work. Okay, now I'm going to partly tighten up the hub nut and finish that off with a torque wrench. And the factory torque settings is 181 Newton meters. Now if you're doing this job on your own, you might want to use a tire lever and lever that up against the caliper itself. Next I'll be locking down that hub nut, and we've got to hit it into that groove of the CV shaft in there. If you remember earlier in the video, that hub nut wasn't even locked down properly. And that's what it's supposed to look like, so that nut will now never unscrew unless it was forced off. And now it's time to fit the wheel. Now when I do up the wheel nuts, I only semi-tighten the wheel nuts. Never tighten them all the way with a rattle gun because you can cause damage. The torque settings are 108 Newton meters for this particular car. Now whenever you're changing a wheel bearing or a wheel hub, always do it in a pair, so your left and right you replace. Never replace just the one side. But due to the filming of this video and not letting the video drag on, I've only done the one side, but I will do the other side later on. So now you know how to change a front wheel bearing on a front wheel drive car. Now this being a Honda Jazz, the setup and design is almost identical to any other front wheel drive car. If you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button not to miss out on any future videos. And I'll see you next time on the next episode of Red Pill Garage. Thanks for watching.